Ancient DNA broke the map by showing that pure national ancestry was never real. The old story sounded simple. France had the French, Britain had the British, Germany had Germans, Italy had Italians, Greece had Greeks, India had Indians, Japan had Japanese, and every nation seemed to sit on one ancient people who had always been there. Then scientists opened the bones. Inside teeth, skulls, and dense pieces of ancient ear bone, they found another record. The people now called native were often not the first people, or the second, or even the third. They were the living result of arrivals, losses, mergers, and new names laid over much older human movement. That is where the first model broke. This is the sensitive part, so the frame matters. No nation is being ranked here. No people become more real than another. And modern identity does not become fake because older migration happened. A flag is not a gene. A language is not a chromosome. A passport is not an ancient bone. What ancient DNA proved was narrower and more dangerous to old myths. National ancestry is not a sealed bloodline. It is an archive of replacement, survival, marriage, invasion, famine, trade, farming, war, and neighbor joining neighbor, until a later generation gave the mixture a national name. For most of history, people drew the map backward. They looked at modern borders and imagined those borders reaching deep into the Ice Age. A village in England became ancient English soil. A valley in France became ancient French blood. A mountain in Greece became timeless Greek descent. A family name in India or Japan was treated like proof that the same biological people had stood there unchanged for thousands of years. Ancient DNA does not read the map that way. The science starts with material taken from human remains. A tooth, a femur, a skull fragment. Most important, the petrous bone, the hard part of the inner ear that can protect DNA long after the rest of the body has decayed. When researchers sequence that DNA, they can compare ancient people to other ancient people and to living populations. That comparison does not produce national passports. It produces ancestry components, traces of shared descent from older populations that moved, mixed, split, and sometimes vanished. A component can point toward steppe pastoralists, Anatolian farmers, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Jomon-related ancestry, or ancient Iranian-related groups. It cannot tell anyone who had the right to belong. That boundary matters. Ancient DNA is not a weapon for modern politics. It cannot decide citizenship, land ownership, cultural loyalty, intelligence, moral worth, or authenticity. It can show that a person buried under a modern country may be genetically different from people who lived there later. It can show that a famous national identity formed after several older populations had already merged. It can show that the pure origin story was a myth. That alone is enough to collapse the old map. Institutions such as the Max Planck Institute and Harvard's Ancient DNA Lab help turn speculation into measurable evidence. Nature papers compared genome-wide data from radiocarbon-dated remains, sometimes from hundreds of ancient individuals. Archaeologists could see the grave, the pottery, the burial style, and the date. Geneticists could see whether the person under that grave marker belonged mostly to an earlier local population or to a newly arrived one. The result was not a clean family tree. It was a series of crossings. Europe gives the clearest first shock because Europe built many of the loudest myths of national purity. The modern map shows neat shapes: Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Greece, Poland, Scandinavia. The genetic map underneath is older, blurrier, and much harder to turn into a slogan. After the Ice Age, Europe was home to hunter-gatherer groups scattered across forests, rivers, coastlines, and refuges. Some of these people carried ancestry that geneticists call Western hunter-gatherer. They lived long before France, Germany, Britain, or Italy had those names. Their world was not a map of countries. It was a map of animals, seasons, stone tools, shorelines, caves, and fire. Then farming arrived. Around 8,000 years ago, people with ancestry tied to Neolithic Anatolia began moving into Europe. They brought crops, animals, polished stone tools, settled villages, and a different genetic profile. In many regions, they did not simply teach farming to everyone already there. They became a major part of the population. The old hunter-gatherer layer did not vanish everywhere, but it was reduced, absorbed, and reshaped. A later country could call the land its homeland. The DNA remembered earlier turnover. Then came another layer from the steppe. During the Bronze Age, pastoralist groups connected to the Pontic-Caspian steppe moved westward into Europe. They carried ancestry linked to cultures such as Yamnaya and related groups, and their arrival changed the genetic profile of large parts of the continent. In some regions, the shift was small enough to look like mixture. In others, it was dramatic enough to look like population replacement. This happened before the modern nations existed. It happened before many modern languages had their present forms. It happened before national myths had the words they would later use to defend themselves. Britain makes the pattern visible. A skeleton such as Cheddarman, found in Gough's cave and dated to the Mesolithic period, belongs to a Britain before farming, before Stonehenge was built, before English, before the island had anything resembling the identity later called British. He was part of an older hunter-gatherer world. His genome did not look like a modern national certificate. It looked like a clue from a vanished population layer. Then, Neolithic farmers reached Britain. They built monuments, kept animals, planted crops, and carried ancestry tied to earlier farming expansions from the continent. Their genetic profile differed strongly from the hunter-gatherers before them. The island had already changed. Then, the Bell Beaker-associated groups arrived. Studies of ancient British remains showed that after about 2500 BCE, people associated with Bell Beaker material culture brought a large shift in ancestry. In broad terms, much of the earlier Neolithic genetic profile was replaced or transformed by people with substantial steppe-related ancestry. The pottery changed, the graves changed, the DNA changed. That was not a small footnote, it was a warning. If someone imagines Britain as one ancient biological line, the ancient bodies under Britain do not cooperate. The island had hunter-gatherers, then it had farmers, then it had Bell Beaker-associated groups with a different ancestry profile. Later, it had Roman-era movement, Anglo-Saxon migration, Viking Age settlement, Norman conquest, and centuries of smaller movements across the North Sea, the Channel, and the Atlantic. At each point, someone could have pointed to the land and said, "These are the real people." At each later point, the genome would have answered, "Which layer?" The second layer was stranger. Early medieval cemeteries in England gave scientists another shock. Burials from the Anglo-Saxon period showed that some people carried ancestry closely related to continental Northern European populations. This does not mean every person in England was replaced. It does not mean culture moved only by blood. It means the formation of English identity included real migration and mixture, not just a new language floating over an unchanged population. Some graves showed continental ancestry. Some showed more local ancestry. Some communities were mixed. Burial goods could suggest one cultural identity, while DNA showed a more complicated family story. A brooch, a weapon, or a bead necklace could not always tell the whole truth. The map was already collapsing. The Vikings added another complication. Viking Age genomes across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, the North Atlantic, and Eastern routes showed movement in several directions. People identified with Viking activity were not genetically identical copies of one northern type. Some carried ancestry from the British Isles, some from the Baltic, some from southern Europe. Some were buried with Scandinavian cultural signals while carrying mixed backgrounds. Then the Normans arrived in 1066. Their conquest changed language, law, landholding, and elite culture. But genetic impact and cultural impact are not the same thing. A ruling class can change names, documents, architecture, and power without replacing most of the population. Ancient DNA forces that distinction into view. Culture can conquer faster than genes. Genes can move without leaving famous chronicles. Both can happen together. That is why national ancestry cannot be read like a royal family tree. It is not one founding father multiplied through time. It is a crowd of older populations, some visible in documents, some visible only in bones. France shows the same problem. The modern French identity sits over layers of Ice Age survivors, Neolithic farmers, steppe-related Bronze Age people, Celtic-speaking groups, Roman-era movement, Germanic Franks, Mediterranean links, Atlantic links, and later regional mixtures. None of those layers alone is France. Together, after language, law, monarchy, church, republic, schooling, and borders, they became ancestors of people now called French. Germany has the same trap. Germanic identity did not arise from untouched blood waiting behind modern borders. Central Europe carried hunter-gatherer, farmer, steppe, Celtic, Roman, Slavic, Baltic, Scandinavian, and many regional layers. The word German became meaningful in history. The DNA underneath was older than the word. Italy complicates the myth even more. The peninsula was never sealed. Farmers, steppe-related groups, Etruscans, Italic speakers, Greeks in the south, Phoenician and Mediterranean traders, Romans, enslaved people, soldiers, merchants, Lombards, Byzantines, Arabs in Sicily, Normans, and regional isolates all left different kinds of marks. Some were cultural, some were genetic, some were both. Greece also cannot be reduced to one untouched ancient line. Ancient Aegean DNA showed continuity in some layers and major mixture in others, including ancestry connected to Anatolian Neolithic farmers and later steppe-related inputs. The people of the Bronze Age Aegean were not empty symbols. They were real populations in motion, tied to islands, palaces, trade routes, and older farming worlds. The evidence points to a tighter conclusion. Nations are real historical communities, but they are not ancient genetic containers. The first answer was migration, but migration was not the deepest problem. The deeper problem was time. Push the timeline back far enough, and even continental labels begin to look too simple. Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, North Africans, and many other broad groups are not pure origin boxes. They are later names for populations shaped by older splits, older mixtures, and older encounters. One of those encounters happened before nations, before farming, before writing, before the first city wall. In 2010, researchers at the Max Planck Institute published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. The result changed the human family tree. People outside sub-Saharan Africa carried small amounts of Neanderthal ancestry. Not a large amount. Not an identity, not a badge of worth, but enough to prove that modern humans and Neanderthals had met and had children. The human family tree had crossed branches. Then Denisova Cave in Siberia added another record. A tiny finger bone and later other remains helped identify Denisovans, a population related to Neanderthals but distinct from them. Denisovan-related ancestry appears at especially notable levels in some Oceanian populations, and at lower levels in parts of Asia. The exact history is still being refined, but the message is already clear. Even the category modern human carries old mixture. That does not make nations illusions. It means the biological history under nations is far older than the political stories told on top of them. A modern person may feel British, Italian, Indian, Japanese, Greek, Nigerian, Mexican, or German with complete sincerity. Culture, family memory, language, food, ritual, law, and place all matter. Ancient DNA does not erase those things. It removes the fantasy that they came from one sealed biological source. South Asia shows how powerful and how sensitive this can become. For a long time, origin stories in the subcontinent were argued through language, caste, religion, archaeology, and politics. Ancient DNA and population genetics did not make those arguments simple. They made them harder to flatten. Research on ancient and modern genomes pointed toward major mixtures among groups related to ancient Iranian agricultural ancestry, indigenous South Asian hunter-gatherer-related ancestry, and steppe pastoralist-related ancestry. Those are not modern castes. They are not modern religions. They are not modern national identities. They are older ancestry layers. Ancient DNA from sites connected to the broader Indus Valley civilization world, along with large-scale genetic studies, suggested that South Asian populations formed through deep mixture before many later identities hardened. Over time, endogamy, marriage within defined communities, preserved some genetic structure. Caste, language, region, and local history shaped who married whom. But structure is not purity. A wall built later does not prove the land beneath it was always divided. The South Asian case also shows why the caveats are not decoration. DNA cannot tell someone what language they should speak, which god they should worship, whether they belong to a nation, or whether their family memory has value. It can show that the ancestry beneath modern India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and surrounding regions is older and more layered than any single origin claim. A person can inherit several ancient streams and one modern identity. That is normal human history. The genome kept one more record. The same pattern appears in East Asia, though the details differ. Japan is often imagined from the outside as a clear island lineage. The ancient DNA record is more layered. Jomon-related ancestry connects to long-standing hunter-gatherer communities in the Japanese archipelago. Later, Yayoi period migrations from the continent brought rice farming and additional ancestry. Later regional variation and historical movement added further texture. Modern Japanese identity was not created by DNA alone. It was shaped by language, agriculture, state formation, ritual, writing, war, island geography, and cultural memory. But the older genetic record shows that even an island nation with strong continuity was not one untouched biological line. The same caution applies everywhere. Isolation can preserve ancestry. It does not create moral purity. Continuity can be real. It does not mean no mixture happened. Migration can be large. It does not make later people less authentic. That is where the old map failed. It confused ancestry with ownership. It treated the present border as an ancient container. It took a modern label and pushed it backward through time until the evidence broke. Consumer DNA tests can accidentally repeat the same mistake. A person opens a report and sees British, Italian, Greek, German, Indian, Japanese, Scandinavian, Balkan, Iberian, or West African on a screen. The label feels ancient. It looks official. It has a percentage beside it, maybe with a colored map and a clean border. But those labels usually come from comparisons to modern reference panels or to recent populations used as statistical anchors. They are useful, but they are not pure origin certificates. They do not mean that 10% of your blood comes from a sealed ancient nation called Italy, or that 30% of your genome is a timeless biological substance called British. They mean your DNA resembles people in a reference group more than it resembles other reference groups, at the level the company is measuring. That difference matters. A British label may contain older hunter-gatherer, farmer, steppe, bell beaker, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Roman, Celtic, Roman, and later movement. An Italian label may contain Northern, Central, Southern, Mediterranean, Alpine, Balkan, Near Eastern, and ancient local layers, depending on region. A Greek label may carry Aegean, Anatolian, Balkan, steppe-related, Slavic, Mediterranean, and local island histories in different proportions. The nation name is a recent handle placed on an older mixture. This does not make the label useless, it makes it limited. It can help families find relatives, it can reveal recent ancestry, it can point toward migrations within the last few centuries. It can expose adoption, hidden parentage, diaspora history, or a family story that never reached the children. But when the label is treated as an ancient biological category, the screen begins to lie by being too neat. That is why DNA should not be used to police belonging. A person is not more or less English because one ancient component is higher. A person is not more or less Japanese because one Jomon-related estimate is lower. A person is not more or less Indian because their ancestry carries different proportions from different ancient sources. Citizenship, culture, language, family, and belonging are not awarded by a chromosome. The genome can reveal ancestry. It cannot issue permission to exist. This is where the collapsed map matters most. It changes what the word ancestry should mean when it sits beside a flag. Ancestry is not a purity test. It is a history of contact. It is the record of people surviving cold periods, following herds, planting grain, crossing seas, marrying strangers, burying children, learning new languages, absorbing enemies, fleeing drought, serving armies, trading metal, and rebuilding after collapse. The old national myth wanted one root. The genome showed a root system. Look again at Britain. The first people after the Ice Age were not the same as the farmers who came later. The farmers were not the same as the Bell-Beaker-associated groups who transformed much of the ancestry profile. Those people were not the same as the later populations who carried Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, Norman, and other continental links into the island story. Yet modern Britain can still be real. It is real as history, not as pure blood. Look again at France. The French did not descend from one untouched tribe waiting patiently for the modern state. They came from layers of local survival and incoming movement, from Gaulish worlds, Roman roads, Frankish elites, Atlantic villages, Mediterranean ports, mountain valleys, and later national formation. France became France through history. The DNA was there before the name. Look again at Germany. The old map wants German identity to sit on a clean Germanic foundation. The ancient map shows Central Europe as a corridor, not a vault. Steppe ancestry, farmer ancestry, hunter-gatherer ancestry, Celtic regions, Roman frontiers, Slavic neighbors, Baltic contacts, and medieval settlement all helped shape the people who later lived inside German-speaking worlds. A corridor does not make a people false. It makes them human. Look again at South Asia. The desire for one origin is powerful because identity there is tied to language, faith, caste, region, and painful modern politics. But the genetic record points to older mixtures that cannot be honestly forced into one modern claim. Ancient Iranian-related ancestry, indigenous South Asian hunter-gatherer-related ancestry, and steppe-related ancestry moved through different histories before later communities hardened boundaries. The archive is older than the argument. Look again at Japan. Island geography preserved important continuity, especially with Jomon-related ancestry in some regions. But the Yayoi migration and later variation showed that Japanese identity, like other identities, formed through both continuity and arrival. A nation can have deep roots and still be mixed. Those facts do not cancel each other. The map collapsed because it was drawn too clean. For older textbooks, the human story often looked like lines spreading from a source into separate branches. One branch became this people, another branch became that people. National histories then borrowed that shape and turned it into belonging. The past became a set of separate pipes, each carrying one ancestry into the present. Ancient DNA replaced the pipes with a river delta. Streams separated, streams merged. Some dried out. Some carried silt from far away. Some changed course after climate pressure, farming, disease, conquest, or trade. By the time a modern nation appeared, the water had already passed through many channels. That image is not an attack on identity. It releases people from a false burden. Purity myths make people guard a past that never existed. They force nations to pretend that mixture is damage, when mixture is one of the ordinary ways human populations survived. A farming revolution required movement. A climate crisis forced movement. A disease wave could change who lived, who married, and who carried descendants forward. Trade routes tied distant coasts together. Empires moved soldiers, captives, craftsmen, administrators, and families across borders that later people would treat as ancient walls. Mixture was not contamination. It was the normal engine of human history. There were losses in that engine. Ancient DNA is not a cheerful record. Some turnovers may reflect violence, disease, displacement, or social collapse. A sudden ancestry shift in a burial series can mean newcomers arrived in large numbers. It can also mean earlier people were pushed aside, absorbed, or reduced until their genetic signal became faint. The genome remembers survival, but it also remembers disappearance. That is why the evidence should be handled carefully. When scientists compare ancient genomes, they are not just comparing percentages. They are reading the remains of people who had mothers, tools, injuries, meals, graves, and names that may be lost forever. A skull in a museum drawer was once a child. A tooth drilled for DNA came from a person who lived under a sky that had no modern border drawn beneath it. The collapse map should create humility, not triumph. It should make the viewer suspicious of anyone who says a nation has one pure biological owner. It should also make the viewer suspicious of anyone who says DNA makes culture meaningless. Both claims are too simple. The genome can prove mixture. It cannot measure the meaning of a lullaby, a prayer, a legal tradition, a mother tongue, or a family graveyard. Identity lives in history. DNA records ancestry. They overlap, but they are not the same thing. The opening contradiction now looks different. Ancient DNA did not prove that nations are fake. It proved that nations are young, compared with the bodies beneath them. It proved that the people who later became native were usually descendants of earlier strangers, earlier locals, earlier survivors, earlier invaders, earlier farmers, earlier captives, and earlier neighbors. The native of one century was often the migrant of an earlier one. That sentence can feel dangerous only if purity is the standard. If survival is the standard, it becomes ordinary. Every population alive today descends from people who endured enough to leave children. Some endured by staying, some by moving, some by mixing, some by changing language, changing gods, changing crops, changing alliances, or changing the story their grandchildren told about where they came from. The genome does not shame that, it preserves it. Ancient DNA made national ancestry more layered, not less meaningful. Britain did not vanish when its older layers appeared. Japan did not vanish when Jomon and Yayoi ancestry were both visible. India did not vanish when deeper mixtures became measurable. France, Germany, Italy, Greece, and other nations were not erased when the ancient map grew more complicated. They became younger than their myths and more human than their slogans. That is the real collapse. Not the collapse of people, not the collapse of culture, not the collapse of belonging. The map that collapsed was the fantasy that one flag could reach backward unchanged into the bones of the Ice Age. The genome remembers movement before borders. It remembers kinship before flags. It remembers mixture before national names. If this kind of evidence matters to you, subscribe to the Genome Archive for careful genetic history, ancient DNA mysteries, and the parts of the human record most people were never taught to read. The purpose is not to rank people, strip identity away, or turn ancestry into a political weapon. The purpose is to read the record without pretending it says something cleaner than it does. No pure national bloodline, no superior origin, no biological ownership of identity. Only evidence, migration, survival, and memory.